Hey, Anthony, thanks so
Hey,
much for
Jen.
meeting with me.
Yeah, of course. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, it's really great. So, as you know, I'm doing this so that it helps students learn about what their possible future careers could be like. So, let's start off with where did you grow up? What high school did you go to? And how did you decide Cabrillo?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was actually born in Sri Lanka, but I left when I was a little kid, and when I was 5, we moved to the States. And through sort of a bizarre, fortuitous turn of luck, ended up in Santa Cruz. So pretty much my childhood and home is Santa Cruz, and maybe a little more so Aptos. But went to elementary school, junior high, and high school in Santa Cruz County, and graduated from Harbor High in 2007. And I initially got into engineering because I just grew up with a love of cars and bikes, and that was,
Huh.
still to this day like a big part of my life and something I care a lot about. But I grew up watching Formula One when I was a kid through like the early
Oh,
90s. And that was probably like I think the first foray into like any sort of mechanical thing um, it was like the first mechanical thing that really caught my attention. And then I think in junior year of high school, I remember one of my math teachers actually passing out a flyer talking about Engineering 5 at Cabrillo.
okay.
And so through that, I got exposed to the engineering program at Cabrillo. And I always kind of knew I wanted to go down that path. Um, as a son of Asian parents, it's usually doctor, lawyer, engineer. So uh, engineer was kind of my chosen path, but it was something I really cared a lot about. And in my free time, I was always tinkering with stuff and taking things apart. So it felt like the right path for me. And I learned really a lot about engineering at Cabrillo through that program. But prior to that as well, when we had moved to the States, my mom, my sister, and my dad all took classes through Cabrillo, and it helped our family out massively. And it was just a huge asset to us and something I really care about deeply. So, it felt like the right thing to do.
Cool. And so you're a tinkerer, so that's how you decided about engineering. So now you're at Cabrillo, and I imagine you're starting to take the classes. And how did you decide to go mechanical?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I look back on it,
Probably maybe the cars, maybe the whole Formula One.
I think so. I think the cars part of it was a big piece of it too, but I was also looking at like biomedical. I think
Okay.
at the time, like biomedical devices and biomedical engineering was sort of becoming more of a thing. And so I was really kind of unsure like where to sort
Hmm.
of specialize. But, in high school, I'd always loved biology. And, that was like, I had a really influential teacher in high school that sort of instilled a love of like biology
Hmm.
and kind of life sciences. And I think at the time I was trying to pick, and I kind of knew that mechanical engineering was a pretty cool degree because it gave you a lot of flexibility.
Right.
It didn't really pigeonhole you into going down one particular path. It gave you a lot of optionality. And at the time, it felt like the right thing to focus on, so that I would just have kind of like a broad set of skills, and from there, kind of pick and choose what I really wanted to go into. But as I kind of went through that, I did really start to kind of find myself being really interested in more mechanical components and
Hmm.
things like that. So yeah, I felt like the right decision to move in that direction. And that's ultimately why I chose
Great.
mechanical.
Hey, before I started taping, you said that you're still in touch with the fellow friends from Cabrillo, and that's true with most alumni. So, tell me about how you build relationships here.
Yeah, so at the time when I was there, we had the PLC, the Physics Learning Center, and I think that's where a lot of the engineering students hung out. One thing that was kind of unique to me, I had gone to Cabrillo fresh out of high school, and a lot of the people that I would take classes with were a little bit older than me, so it was kind of unique to get that perspective of people that had had life experiences and been through things, and you kind of learn from them a little bit. And strangely enough, just built really great relationships that I still kind of lean on today. And that was a huge part of why, I have really fond memories of Cabrillo is like just the people. Like you meet
Yeah.
so many people from different walks of life, different experiences. And then, I think the faculty and staff are really world class. I mean, like, I hate to say it, but even compared to Cal, at times I felt like my education from Cabrillo was way better. So it was at the time you don't realize it, but living in Santa Cruz County, Cabrillo is such an asset to the
Mhm.
community. And it does so much good for, everybody in Santa Cruz County. So I'm very grateful for it. But yeah, the people are ultimately something that I still have very fond memories of, like the teachers, and then yeah, the friends. Like I still stay in touch with a lot of the guys that I went through undergrad classes with.
Mm, cool. All right, you want to talk about your path to Berkeley? Like what did made you choose Berkeley and then how was Berkeley and maybe talk about your senior project that you worked on?
Yeah, Berkeley was really interesting. I had picked between Berkeley and Davis. I think growing up in Santa Cruz, I wanted to leave. I didn't really want to stay, which now that I look back on it, maybe a little bit of a immature decision because Santa
Mm,
Cruz is amazing. But um, you know, Berkeley, I always knew had a world-class like mechanical engineering program, and I really wanted exposure to that sort of environment to kind of understand like okay, like what is sort of the cutting edge of engineering working on, and what sort of research are they doing. Um,
yeah.
and so that was my number one. And then, number two was UC Davis because my sister had gone to school there. So I kind of just knew the campus in the area. Um, but yeah, I kind of had my sights set on Berkeley from the get-go and was really fortunate to get in, sort of the stars aligned and
Mm,
at the time, everything kind of worked out to where I was able to transfer as a transfer student and go into junior year. But I think for me it was partially location. It was still kind of close to Santa Cruz. The environment, I stepped on campus there and it just felt so much like Santa Cruz. So it sort of felt
mm,
like a continuation of something I knew. And then I think yeah, like the academic kind of rigor and just the challenges of Berkeley. Cal is a really unique environment, and there's a lot of good and some not so good, but I would say the good definitely outweighs the bad. But it really pushes you and it really kind of challenges you in a lot of ways and exposes you to a lot. So there was definitely a lot of good that came out of that experience for sure.
mm, yeah. And typically engineers are doing a senior project where you're working with
Yeah.
industry or working with fellow students. And I'd like to hear a little bit about what that project was that you worked on.
Yeah. So at Cal, we actually designed, so this is back in like 2010, 2011, we designed a quadcopter. So we had
Mm,
designed sort of like a autonomous system for flying what is now like just a typical drone. But it was pretty neat. Like at the time, there wasn't a lot in the way of mechanical framing and parts to build these little devices. So we had to like machine the frame, wire up the individual motors, write the control systems, and then ultimately get it flying. So that was our senior design project. Um, it was pretty cool. It was, compared to the new DJI drones and stuff, like nothing like what's out there now. But it was pretty cool to just kind of see how it was all built and,
yeah,
ultimately like build the physical thing in and of itself.
yeah. All right, why don't you start talking about your career path then, what you did after you left Berkeley and then your transition from one area to another.
Yeah, totally. So as I was kind of going through undergrad, one of the things that I always kind of went back to and loved was like AutoCAD and 3D design systems and, ultimately kind of software in a way. And when I graduated Cal, I found a job at Siemens. So Siemens is a
Mm,
big German kind of electrical engineering company, also mechanical design engineering company, but they had a software division that was primarily selling what's referred to as PLM software. So PLM software is essentially the software used to coordinate the creation of any sort of physical product. So, for example, like an iPhone has thousands of components in it. So how do you actually track the components that make up the iPhone? How do you think about supply chain, design, CAD drawings, revisions, all
mm,
of that? And so in hindsight, it was kind of a really good fit because it was sort of tangential to kind of the CAD 3D modeling space, but you got to work really closely with engineering teams at these companies and help them implement these systems. And so it was sort of like a pseudo software engineering kind of consulting job where we would go into these customer environments, help them take the software and really kind of mold it to the processes that they had and, help them sort of refine their design processes. And in that process, I I would just kind of naturally find myself in that role where I was doing a lot of customer facing work and explaining like how pieces of the platform would work. Um, and through that, I kind of was just spending a lot of time with the sales guys,
Yeah.
and I would just kind of see like the the day to day of their life. And one thing I really loved about it was like just the dynamic nature of it. Like you would just meet so many different people, you would get so much exposure to like different industries, different companies. Um, and that really appealed to me, sort of like maybe the ADD part of my brain that just really found that attractive. But it was really cool. So I had every intention of trying to transition into kind of a business sales role there. Unfortunately at Siemens, that career path is kind of a long one. So I started
Mm,
to look elsewhere and, was really lucky to run into a manager of a company called Internap that was working on IT infrastructure. So it was some of the more lower lying systems that our software would potentially run on, right?
yeah.
So he,
How did you run into him?
yeah, it was just through kind of a networking situation,
Right.
somebody connected me with him, and
Okay.
honestly, I think the only reason he took a meeting with me was partially because he saw that I had kind of an engineering degree, and so it was sort of like, okay, I think this guy can think and probably figure this stuff out, and
Okay.
at the time he took a huge risk on me, and gave me now that I look back on it, an opportunity to work in a position that I was really underqualified for. But just really worked super hard and got a little bit lucky and found a little bit of success and found myself working more and more in kind of like an outside sales capacity.
Mm.
Um, and this was back in like 2013.
Oh,
So it's
wow. Okay.
yeah, so it's pretty fresh out of college.
Yeah.
And it was really fortuitous timing too, because like the internet infrastructure industry was going through some changes with the adoption of like cloud hosting and cloud technologies becoming more prevalent. And so I got a lot of exposure to that. And so from selling data center space, IP transit, network services, ended up joining a startup that kind of spun out of that company and was one of the first sales guys there. And so worked on a network startup for a little bit, and then have been kind of working across a couple different companies, all in sort of the business kind of sales go-to market motion. So it's all about helping our business grow and getting new customers and really helping them solve problems, leveraging our software and our products. And so worked across a network startup, worked at a big data startup for a little bit.
Wow.
That didn't go super well. And then, most recently, it's kind of a later stage startup that's in the observability space. So we essentially sell software to engineers that can help monitor the applications that they're building and
Okay.
running. So you can think of anybody from like a Wells Fargo or JPMC to the Ubers and the Robloxes and the Facebooks of the world, use pieces of our software to make sure
Right.
all their applications are running well. Yeah.
Wow, that sounds really exciting.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. If I had told my 21-year-old self that I'd be doing this, I probably wouldn't have believed like that would be the career path, but it's been really interesting. I think having the engineering degree gives you a lot more credibility when we're selling to engineers, just because you're able to explain technical concepts really well and kind of empathize with just the challenges that they have in their day-to-day life. And after a while, like it just feels like more of a natural motion of building relationships and helping these guys solve problems. And,
Yeah.
ultimately selling the software is kind of the byproduct of all of that.
Yeah.
So it's been a really rewarding career. And, for the stuff that kind of makes me tick, I am really grateful that I'm able to kind of work in this space. And, if I really think back on it, I think getting that engineering degree like helped open up the door to a lot of that. So that was really kind of a foundational piece of going about doing that and sort of ending up where I'm at right now. So yeah.
Wow. And the next question I was going to ask you is, what has your engineering degree done for your quality of life? And you're actually talking a little bit about that, but maybe you could
Yeah.
relate it to your private life. What else is the engineering degree besides opening so many doors?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely helps with like living in a very high cost of living area. Like living in the Bay Area is definitely not cheap, and it definitely makes it a little bit easier. On the personal side, I think one thing I really appreciate is that it teaches you how to learn really quickly.
Mm,
I think that's something I didn't really appreciate, but like one of the powers that you can really get going through this engineering program is like, hey, you may not know everything, but I think you kind of pick up the foundational elements to sort of learn how to learn, which
mm.
sounds really weird, but
No,
if you
it's right on.
like
It's true.
if you can do that, you can kind of go do anything, right? Um, and I think at Cal, it was just such a humbling experience to sort of be surrounded by these people that are so intelligent and so smart, but if you kind of take a bit of a step back, you can also realize like there's so much to learn from like being around these people. And I guess to your earlier question, like how has it sort of impacted my life outside of maybe work? I think it helps you kind of listen. It
Mm,
helps you understand, and if you don't understand, seek to understand. I think engineers are always trying to get to like the root of the answer, and I think an engineering degree sort of helps you develop the framework to kind of build to that, right? It's to
yeah.
try to understand and ultimately get to like that, like how does this end up being, sort of
Yeah.
situation. So yeah.
And you said you just came back from Seattle, so it sounds like you are traveling a little bit or a lot. How much are you
Yeah,
traveling for your business?
yeah, it kind of varies. So, we have customers, I was traveling a lot to like New York, to Charlotte last year. And this year it's a little bit more West Coast focused. But yeah, one aspect of the job that's kind of fun is like we do get to go travel and go visit like clients at sites at their offices, and get a sense of what they're working on and really spend time with them. So yeah, I was up in Seattle the past couple days and then just got back last night. So it is fun. We're moving around a lot, and it's never a dull moment, that's for sure.
Mm, nice. All right. Well, how about lastly, what are some suggestions you have for students who are maybe starting out at Cabrillo or just finishing up and ready to transfer? What are some things when you look back, you think, oh, I wish I knew that, or
Yeah, I think at Cabrillo, like I don't think there's really a need to rush it. I think take your time. Um, you know, and I think at the end of the day, it's about like completing it and really understanding things. And for me, I think I over-indexed a little too much on like just making sure the grades were the only thing I cared about. And I think just by doing that, I sort of, glossed over, missing some more of the concepts and really understanding things at a deeper level. So I would say like slow down. The grades aren't that important. They're important, but they're not the most important thing in the world. Um, I think, you know, kind of get your hands dirty, build stuff and just experiment. I think for kids that are transferring to like maybe research institutions, one thing I wish I had done was I wish I had gotten into like research labs like really early. So like, as a junior, just like cold email professors, like and ask like, hey, can I just talk to you about your research? Obviously do some research ahead of time of what they're working on and what their lab cares about. But I wish I had done that a little bit more so I could have been able to work as part of a lab and potentially like get deeper into stuff like that. And then I think the other thing too is like, yeah, make sure you're kind of interested in the topic, like don't force yourself to go through it if you're not into it.
mm,
I think I saw a lot of people do that, but
mm,
yeah, like I would also just say like kind of growing up in Santa Cruz and go through the high school motion, you sort of there's like this kind of I don't know if it's still the case, but like there was always kind of this like underlying sentiment that like if you just go to Cabrillo straight out of high school, you're not like successful. But I think that's such a false narrative and just so not true. Like, I got accepted to four-year universities out of high school, and I chose Cabrillo because like there's just so much opportunity and I think there's such a good safety net to let you kind of experiment, try things out, and also learn in a
mm,
little bit of like a less like lower pressure environment. And for some people, that can be a really good thing, and it's
mm.
just an amazing resource that you shouldn't take for granted. So I think for
Mm.
for kids coming out of high school, like, go to Cabrillo, even if you start off in engineering and end up somewhere totally different, like get exposure to as much as you can, just try different things. And then for kids that are transferring, this is a little specific to research institutions, but like go meet your professors, try find a lab that's doing interesting work and try to get deeper into that. And then I think at the end of the day, it's like it's all about like just getting through it, like even if you get like C's and D's and you're barely, like getting through it, if you're really passionate about it, just like keep going, don't stop. And I think that was like one of the lessons and takeaways that I had, like some of like some of my like peers at Cabrillo, like I always like admired how persistent they were. I won't name names, but like there are some people that failed classes multiple times, but they just kept going back and they kept
Yeah.
working through it and they got through it. And
Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, that's all that matters. It
Yeah.
doesn't really matter how long it takes you, as long as you just keep going and
Yeah.
you keep working towards it, you're gonna get there. So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know, just some things to think about.
No, I think those are great tidbits. All
Yeah,
right, I'm going to stop the recording, I think, unless there's something else.
cool.
Okay.